Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. It's a pleasure to welcome back to our studio today one of our favorite guests, our legal eagle, Professor David Schultz of Hamline University and the University of Minnesota Law School. Welcome back, Professor. Good to have you on our show today.
My pleasure, and thank you for the audience for listening.
Let us jump right into it. We've got a lot of ground to cover. You have been very busy. You just released a report a few days ago titled The Price of Injustice, which examines police misconduct payouts by different units of government in the state of Minnesota over a 10-year period from January 1st, 2010 to December 31st of 2020. Do I have the dates right?
You're absolutely correct.
And what inspired you to undertake this study?
What inspired me was a series of questions that happened after George Floyd's murder, and the City of Minneapolis did a payout. And I was getting calls from reporters in Minnesota and across the country saying, well, how much do cities pay out? How much are we seeing nationwide? And there is no national database. There's no statewide database. And so I thought, what's a good thing to do is let's gather information. Let's find out, in fact, how much is being spent yearly or by decade in Minnesota. And to me, what I wanted to find out also is that if these payouts are telling us something about the types of situations that really arise to what? That create police misconduct. So it's really the idea of saying, if we're talking about reforming police, if we want to have some idea of what's happening with policing in Minnesota, let's find out what's happening in terms of payouts. And that was the reason why I decided to do this.
And so what was the time period that you and your research assistant actually used? How long did it take to gather this data, and how did you get it?
It took over 2 years to gather all this information. So here's what we did. What we did is we sent a Freedom of Information request, or it's called a FOIA request, up to all cities in Minnesota, a population of 5,000 and more, all 87 counties, the state troopers, the U of M Police Department, and Metro Transit. That essentially gave us coverage, we think, of between 98 to 100% of all of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And we sent out a request to the Freedom of Information officer for each of those jurisdictions and said, we would like, for that 10-year period, a list of all the payouts that you've made for police misconduct, for police behavior. And we sent out roughly 240 requests. we got all 240, roughly 239 requests back in, or I should say all but one in. And all of it came in, and they self-reported. And that's important to understand. This is self-reported information.
Meaning that they have chosen what to report and in the form that they reported to you,
Correct.
responding to your inquiry.
Correct, absolutely correct.
Because right now there is no standardized, there's no mandatory reporting about payouts for police misconduct, and there's no standardized form for reporting misconduct.
Right,
correct?
in terms,
Payouts.
And in terms of the factors such as the race or class or gender or anything like that, in terms of the people filing the complaint. Now, we also knew going into this, I've done other research a couple years ago, when I mean requests nationwide, that some jurisdictions would, when I would make the request, would write back and say, these are out-of-court settlements, we're not going to disclose to you what this is. And so I mention this because I'm assuming what I'm getting here in the self-reporting is everything, but we don't know. So it's an estimate. Okay, so a couple of details. What we learned is that approximately 30% of all the jurisdictions in the state of Minnesota have made some payout in some form. Okay. We know also that the total amount of payout over a decade is roughly $60 million. At least that's what's been reported.
Before we get deep into the numbers, and I do want to ask you about that, but I'd like to touch on something that's in your report, because I think it's a really important point for our viewers, so that people do not hear this interview and think, well, they're going off on an anti-police tirade, defund the police. You state in the report, this report is neither pro nor anti-police. Explain what you mean, and why is it important for Minnesotans to have this data?
Sure. Okay. So start off by saying, let's assume in every year in Minnesota, there's 1 million interactions between police and civilians.
Traffic stops, calls to the home.
Whatever they may be. EMS, whatever they may be, or something like that. What we found is over a decade, so that would be 10 million over a decade, like that. Self-reported, there were less than 500 incidents in terms of self-reporting. So do a little bit of math. 500 over 10 million, we're looking at 99.99% in terms of which there's no problem that has emerged as far as we know.
That leads to an allegation of misconduct, or we should say an allegation that leads to a payout for misconduct.
Correct. So on that score, it might very well vindicate police in terms of saying they're doing a great job.
Yeah.
So we get down, and I use the metaphor of a funnel, 10 million interactions in a decade, get down to 500, only a few number that have actually caused a problem, or a problem where a municipality or a governmental entity feels like they have to make a payout.
And I just want to underscore this point, if I may take the liberty of interjecting an editorial comment. And I know many police officers. I have people in law enforcement in my own family, my nephew. My sense is that the vast majority of police officers in the state of Minnesota are honorable men and women. They do a very difficult job every day to the best of their ability. But there are always, I think, not just in policing, but probably any profession, you have people who do things they shouldn't do. And there are consequences that come from that. So I just want to state that. Let's talk a little bit more about that number.
Sure.
You, in your report, well, first of all, let's mention that when the report initially came out, there was an error.
Correct.
Why don't we talk about that to get that out of the way, first of all? Sure. There was an initial error.
There was an initial error. So the one error was with Minneapolis. And all the other jurisdictions sent us the data. Minneapolis said, go to our website. We have an online site there to calculate it. We had the right 36 million. Somewhere along the line there, I'm going to call it an inputting error. We put a 1 in front of it. We turned the 36 million to 136 million. It was a completely honest and really bad mistake. As soon as I realized it had happened, when I talked to City of Minneapolis, I owned up to it and I said, guess what? We made a mistake. We're going to correct it, and that's what we're in the process of doing right now. Because there's no other way you can handle this.
Right.
I take full responsibility.
But that's what you do. We're all human, and mistakes are made. Unfortunately, it was a $100 million error. But when you discovered it, most importantly, you corrected it and reported it, disseminated the correction.
Correct.
Yeah. So what we're really dealing with until you come out, you're going to be coming out in the next few weeks with a final number.
Correct.
So what we're talking about now is an estimate. estimate that over the 10-year period you studied that the City of Minneapolis paid out $36.5 million. Let's talk about what that figure doesn't include, because the period of your study is from 2010 to 2020. What are some of the key payouts that that figure doesn't include?
Well, it doesn't include, for example, the payout to George Floyd's family, which I think is pretty significant.
$27 million.
Correct. Doesn't include that. And I'll move beyond Minneapolis also. It also doesn't include the payout for the Kim Potter case in Brooklyn Center. And there's a couple of others in Minneapolis that the payouts came after
Justine Damon case, which I think before George Floyd was the record in Minneapolis was a $7 million payment.
Correct.
And then the George Floyd settlement, $27 million.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the time period, we wanted to have it a long enough of a period, 10 years, to kind of deal with like anomalies or something like that. But you're absolutely correct, is that we could take that roughly $36 million in Minneapolis, and if we were to push it a couple more years out to include those others, we would be up to a number probably somewhere around $60 to $70 million in terms of a payout.
Doesn't it seem, David, that when you look at where these payouts are from, I'm talking about the units of government that paid this money for police misconduct, not surprisingly, I don't think they are concentrated in the metro area, because 2/3 of Minnesota's population lives in the metro area. So you expect the interactions between police and citizens to be where people live. That's logical.
Right.
But Minneapolis, even considering that, seems to be an outlier in that they account for something like 60% of the total amount paid out for police misconduct. Say something about that.
You're absolutely correct. You know, Minneapolis population is roughly about, let's say, 450,000 people. It is maybe approximately 9% of the population of the entire state of Minnesota. Yeah, I think we're roughly around maybe 5 million people in the state of Minnesota.
5.5, I think,
so it's even lower. Yeah. So Minneapolis population is probably somewhere around 7%, but they account for 60% of the payouts. And this is important because there is something going on in Minneapolis, but we don't know what. And this is the other part of my study that's important here.
And why don't we know?
We don't know because we don't have a level of detail either in Minneapolis or across the state that we would want to have. And let me tell you a great story. When I'm working on this with my students, and we're sitting in my office and we're licking the envelopes, folding it, and sending it out, and one of my students who's working with me said, "Do you think we're going to find out anything regarding whether or not some of the misconduct involves gender discrimination, sexual harassment, or if it might be about LGBTQ issues?" And I said, "I don't know. We're going to find out." And guess what? We still don't know. We still don't know because we don't have data on race or on gender or sexual orientation.
And this leads to a key recommendation that you're making, that the legislature should consider mandatory reporting and a standardized form that will gather that type of demographic information about cases where there are payouts for police misconduct.
Exactly. And by having it first mandated, remember, it took us 2 years. Freedom of information requests all over the place. It took months in some cases to get this information. We have it, for example, at the national level, we have FBI uniform crime statistics. We gather annual data on so many different things. This is really hard to get information on. And remember, when we're talking about $60 million, taxpayer dollars.
That's money that didn't go to property tax relief, didn't go to parks and recreation, didn't go to housing, affordable housing, other things that local government needs to be involved in.
Exactly. And so
and that's why it's important to people to know, we shouldn't want to see these amounts of money being paid out.
Exactly. But I think it's very important in terms of the disclosure. But the other thing, remember, I said roughly 495 self-reported instances of payouts. An infinitesimally small percentage of all the police-civilian interactions.
Key point. Yeah.
I would love us to be able to key in on those roughly 500. What happened? What happened in those situations?
Are the same officers involved in multiple incidents that result in payouts? Things such as that.
Are these incidences that involve alcohol or guns or drugs? Is there a racial component? We don't know. And so for people who are also on the position of saying, let's defund the police, or we want to make police reform. As I keep saying, you can't make good policy until you have the evidence or data in front of us. And what if it turns out that it is, let's say, all about race? Or let us say the interactions that gone bad are involving situations where guns or alcohol or drugs are involved.
Right.
Maybe that leads us to saying we need to change our protocols. Training needs to be done. And that's the focus that has to be here, is to first say, remember, 99% plus of the incidents, there's no problem.
That's right.
The very small number involving payouts by taxpayers, and can we learn something from that very small number in terms of how to address policing going forward?
Very good. We shall stay tuned for the final version of the report coming out shortly.
Good.
Let's move on to the other big legal story all over the news.
Right.
The former president of the United States, Donald Trump, first time in American history, twice impeached, but now the first time a former president of our country has faced a federal indictment.
Correct.
From a federal court in Miami, Florida. First of all, our viewers know that there was a grand jury impaneled in New York that was looking into Mr. Trump's conduct. But now we found out a few weeks ago that there was also a grand jury in Florida. It's the Florida grand jury that has returned a 7-count federal indictment alleging violations of the Espionage Act.
Right.
Conspiracy, which suggests he recruited other people into an illegal conspiracy, lying to federal officials. What is your sense about what is happening here with the indictment of Mr. Trump, and how big is the legal jeopardy that the former president is facing?
Well, first, remember, the charges in New York also are state charges, and these are federal charges. So I don't want to say we're apples and oranges, but it's important to understand we're looking at different levels of government bringing charges against the President of the United States. These are serious charges. When you start to get into obstruction of justice, when you start to getting into questions all about conspiracy, these are felonies that, if convicted, lead to, in many cases, double-digit, multiple, more than 10 years.
I've heard some of the charges 20 years or longer.
Yeah.
And let's be very clear about something up front, too. President Trump, like any American,
correct,
he is entitled to a presumption of innocence until proven guilty.
Yeah.
And if this case goes to trial, which it may, he's going to be facing a jury of his peers and held accountable. But there are many Republicans who are alleging that this is a politically motivated, they're calling it a persecution, not a prosecution. What do you say about that?
There's no indication on this for a couple of reasons. First, Biden has insulated himself from this decision making. It's a decision that has been confined within the Justice Department with Merrick Garland, the Attorney General. But even more importantly, from what we understand, this is the investigation being driven by the federal attorneys down in Florida. Who
are career prosecutors.
Exactly.
They don't report to Joe Biden.
Absolutely correct. And so there's no indication that this was politically motivated. There is every indication that Trump was also given an opportunity to address these matters. And what I want to talk about here is that we do know that, for example, former Vice President Mike Pence and President Joe Biden had documents in their possession that they weren't supposed to have. And what did they do? They cooperated with the FBI.
They returned the documents.
They returned.
But Mr. Trump didn't do that, right? The archives that was trying to recover documents from him, and many of these were sensitive national security documents. The allegation is that he hid those or dragged negotiations out when the right thing to do would have been to turn the documents back over, right?
Absolutely correct. And
that's why his case is different from Vice President Pence and former Vice President, now President Biden.
That's right. And that's why what's critical here, remember, in American law, it's not just that you did something, but it's about the intentionality.
That's right.
And with Biden and Pence, it was a mistake. They cooperated. They solved the matter. Here, it looks like the government has evidence of willful choices to obstruct justice, willful choices to not return the documents. Conspiracy he's being charged with in terms of what? Working with others to basically be able to hide the documents or to not cooperate.
Tell us real quickly, David, because time is running fast, as it always does on this show. Tell us real quickly what steps come next. That Mr. Trump is going to appear in a court in Florida, in Miami, I believe, on next Tuesday.
Correct.
So by the time this show airs, he will have already made an initial appearance and pleaded not guilty, presumably. What happens after that?
What happens after that, there'll be a lot of pretrial motions and exchanging of evidence.
Called discovery by lawyers.
Discovery.
Right.
And what's also important to understand is that there's a constitutional requirement for prosecutors. It's called the Brady Rule. They have to disclose all evidence, including what's called exculpatory. Exculpatory meaning evidence that would speak perhaps to his innocence. So we're going to be looking at pretrial motions and discovery that'll go several months. Let me speculate on a timeline. Okay. It's right now. It's early June. I could see a scenario where either we're into trial or very close to trial sometime in August or approximately August of 2024, which would put us about what? Around the time of the Republican National Convention, getting ready to move into the general election, which most of us consider starting after Labor Day, of course, like that.
Next year.
Year. So think about this. He also has a trial date of March 2024 back in Manhattan. So he's going to be going from a Manhattan trial, assuming he doesn't plead guilty, and I don't think he's going to, a Manhattan trial and then a trial in Miami. This is going to be fascinating to see how he navigates a couple of indictments. Now, right now, it still looks like his base is behind him. It still looks like it's not hurting him. But who knows what impact this has longer term as the evidence is being released, but even more importantly, what impact does this have at the general election and for, let's say, these swing voters, those few swing voters that are going to decide the election, those independent voters? I can't see that this helps his election. But it's going to be fascinating to watch because he will be the first major party presidential candidate.
He's on track right now to be the nominee.
Exactly.
Unless somebody surprises the Republicans in the primary, whether it's Governor DeSantis or one of the other candidates that are running.
Exactly.
And so we're really on new ground here. We've never seen anything like this.
You're
and
absolutely
it's going to be very interesting to see the twists and turns as they unfold.
And there's going to be, and there's still, don't forget, there are still potentially an indictment coming in Georgia and Fulton County.
For interference in the certification process of Georgia's presidential electors.
And there's also about a half a dozen other civil lawsuits that Trump is still facing for sexual harassment in business dealings. He is going to be potentially in the next year facing incredible amounts of legal scrutiny. And even beyond the issue of how it affects him in terms of, let us say, his standing within the Republican Party, he's got to figure out how to allocate his time between what? Court appearances, not being in court. Campaigning. And I wonder what his attorneys are going to say to them. Are they going to say to him, and what's he going to say to him? Are they going to say to him, or is he going to say to them, I should say, hold the trial, but I'm not going to appear? I'm not going to show up? You and I are both lawyers. I would never, ever tell my client, don't show up to a trial.
It's going to be very interesting. We're down to less than 4 minutes. We got to hit a couple of other issues real quick while I've got you here, David. U.S. Supreme Court closely watched decision came out yesterday about redistricting in the state of Alabama. Very narrow decision, 5-4, but the U.S. Supreme Court overturned a scheme in Alabama, a redistricting scheme, which basically was going to limit the creation of a new congressional district to represent African Americans living in that state. Approximately 27% of Alabama's population happens to be people of color, African American people, but they only have one black representative in their congressional delegation. And the court said Alabama needs to redraw their lines to create a new majority black district. Were you surprised by the outcome of this case?
Oh, I was. I think all of us were surprised because the Roberts Court has waged a war on the Voting Rights Act and has also had a hostility towards considerations of race when it comes to affirmative action and redistricting. This is, I'm going to call it a status quo decision. It preserved the current interpretations of the Voting Rights Act in place, specifically for people who really want to get nerded out here. It preserved what's called the Jingles Rule. That's about creating majority-minority seats at this point. This is a narrow but major victory for the Voting Rights Act, and a very important victory for voting rights, not just in Alabama, but across the country.
We should say this comes on the heels, too, of a previous case in North Carolina, where I believe it was the North Carolina Supreme Court had invalidated a legislative redistricting scheme. So we're going to be hearing more about these types of cases in the future. One of the biggest cases of the current term of the Supreme Court, we should say the court's going to wrap up their business at the end of June to go out for 4th of July, which is coming up shortly, is an affirmative action case from North Carolina. There is a lot of concern and angst that the Supreme Court may very well be poised to abolish affirmative action. What are your thoughts about this? Do you have any prediction about what the Supreme Court may do?
I think it's going to abolish affirmative action. And there's an old phrase in the law, bad cases make bad law. And one of the cases involves Harvard. One of the cases involves the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Yep. So private versus public institution. There is actually a lot of evidence that the Harvard plan actually discriminates against Asian Americans. And this is what makes it really complicated, because for people who say we need to figure out a way of still having affirmative action to really do recruitment of people of color and minorities, Harvard's plan has already been ruled in some cases unconstitutional, as discriminatory towards Asians. So I'm going to be curious to see how the court plays with this. It may turn out that Harvard's bad plan leads to an elimination of all affirmative action.
Which would, you look back, the Bakke decision in 1978 about law school admissions at the University of California, Berkeley, the court in that decision and subsequent decisions reaffirmed the idea that you could consider race, but only as one factor among multiple factors. And so we shall see what happens. But there's so much more we could talk about. We didn't even get to the ethics issues in the U.S. Supreme Court. What that means is we're going to have you back on the show again soon, David. Thank you for joining us today on Access to Democracy. I look forward to welcoming you back to our studio again real soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.